According to the font of all safe knowledge and homogenized information, that is Wikipedia, a conspiracy theory is an explanation for an event that invokes a conspiracy by sinister and powerful actors, often political in motivation, when other explanations are more probable. Conspiracy theories resist falsification and are reinforced by circular reasoning, which is described as both evidence against the conspiracy and an absence of evidence for it are reinterpreted as evidence of its truth, whereby the conspiracy becomes a matter of faith rather than something that can be proved or disproved. So far, we can understand that powerful people would never do anything underhand to protect and/or further their interests. And also, evidence against something and a lack of evidence for it can be twisted to serve the exact opposite viewpoint, but that only a conspiracy theorist would do such a thing. Kind of sounds like circular reasoning to me though, as we've still not yet independently defined what a conspiracy theory is. The article continues. Research suggests that belief in conspiracy theories can be psychologically harmful, and that it is highly correlated with psychological projection, the denial of unconscious impulses or qualities whilst projecting the same onto others, paranoia and Machiavellianism, manipulation, emotional coldness and indifference to morality. Conspiracy theories once limited to fringe audiences have become commonplace in mass media, emerging as a cultural phenomenon of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The psychological aberration which can potentially be experienced as one awakens from the dream/nightmare of living in ignorance and denial of personal truth takes myriad forms, many of which have been given labels so that they can effectively be counselled and medicated back into submission. Another way to see it, one I find slightly less dramatic than calling myself and many of my friends Machiavellian, is that by approaching these darker chapters of the human story, both in the world at large and within ourselves, we are coming to terms with and ultimately purging them from mankind's collective karmic burden, as opposed to continually sweeping them under the rug by denying their existence. The distinction for me is not conspiracy theory versus fact, so much as it is acknowledgement of the inherent darkness within as it manifests without, versus denial of or unawareness of that same darkness. Put simply, if you can't see your own shadow, you will be unable to see the shadows in the world at large. What Wikipedia calls a cultural phenomenon of the 21st century was always the intent behind making social media free to all and concentrating as many users as possible onto as few platforms as possible, thus making potentially subversive ideas much easier to monitor and suppress, although that might just be a conspiracy theory. The article goes on to say in the etymology section, the term conspiracy theory entered everyday language in the United States after 1964, the year in which the Warren Commission shared its findings, with the New York Times running 5 stories that year using the term. Any conspiracy theorist worth his or her salt knows that the Warren Commission was set up to investigate the assassination of JFK. Apparently, the CIA operated a cover-up policy towards the event when dealing with the commission, including hiding its own prior contact with the alleged assassin Lee Harvey Oswald himself. They also hid a plot to use the mafia to assassinate Cuban leader Fidel Castro. 4 of the 7 members of the commission later expressed serious doubts regarding the conclusions which had been reached, that both men in the car were wounded by the so-called magic bullet, and regarding the view that Oswald had acted alone. And if this all sounds a little bit conspiratorial to you, you can look it up. It's on Wikipedia. The important thing to note here is that a mainstream newspaper introduced the term conspiracy theory to the public lexicon in 1964, specifically with the aim of discrediting unpalatable interpretations of the available evidence and discouraging the bulk of the population from looking for themselves or speculating, just as the term fake news has been introduced recently with the same aim. So, to even use such terms is to play with loaded dice. It's a way of saying right from the outset that certain ideas, concepts and explanations are too far-fetched for us even to consider. And that's exactly why these terms are used by the established newspapers and also government spokespersons. Mainstream news outlets deliver fake news constantly, and coincidentally enough, they're also constantly hemorrhaging viewers to more fringe channels who are much more likely to put into words something generally thought-provoking and challenging to the powers that should not be. By labelling these fringe channels fake news any chance they get, they discourage people from going to see what all the fuss is about, while simultaneously preserving their own image as the source of real news. If you want an example, see London Real's recent interview with David Icke, which was forcibly removed from YouTube, not for breaching community guidelines, but under pressure from UK government watchdog Ofcom. The British brainwashing cartel ran a story on the controversial interview's appearance on London Live, a small TV network, and even featured a picture of Icke sitting in the London Real studio. But clearly they didn't want to actually name the YouTube channel for fear of sending more viewers its way. My feelings are right in line with London Real host Brian Rose's own. If these ideas are so fucking cockadoodle crazy, get these nutters into a mainstream TV studio and hear them out. Let the people decide to reject an idea due to lack of merit based on their own informed assessment. But they won't do that. Your average BBC viewer isn't used to such a level of critical thinking, and on listening to Icke would promptly assume the world was ending. People who do like to consider the alternative angle are already deciding in ever-increasing numbers that this blatant level of censorship has now become plain boring. Look at London Real's rocketing subscriber count and viewing figures to see what I mean. Icke's channel was exploding in a similar fashion, that is until YouTube, under pressure from an as yet unknown outside influence, pulled it completely, with no strikes against him, not a single breach of community guidelines. People clearly want to know what could possibly be so downright dangerous about a few words, about a few different ideas. And someone clearly wants these ideas suppressed before they break into the mainstream population.
What is it with you conspiracy guys? You think you've figured out something we all missed? Is that it?
Not really. The things I've figured out are often right there in plain sight. It's really just a question of which way one views certain key pieces of information. They showed the entire world how they dropped those towers back in 2001, live on public television. Then they told a different story over the next few days and said anyone who disagreed was a conspiracy theorist. The simple question is, do you believe George Bush, or do you believe your own eyes and common sense?
You feel like you're better than others, it makes you feel superior.
Again, not really. One of the biggest conspiracy theories out there, just waiting to be uncovered by those of us brave enough to peek behind the curtain, is the idea that you can determine your self-worth by comparing yourself to others. Like most truth seekers, I know from personal experience what social suicide feels like. I know how it feels to put intuition and curiosity before the programmed fear of social ridicule. Does that make me better than others? I'm not playing that game, but I will tell you confidently that I'm a better version of myself for speaking my mind. Personal development comes in many guises, and deconstructing a belief system which has been meticulously constructed in your imagination since birth is no small job.
And what did it feel like when you uncovered the greatest conspiracy of all time? To hide the true shape of the Earth.
You really want to know? It wasn't nearly as big a deal as most muggles might imagine. In fact, it was more a case of, oh, that actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, every single day of my life I've experienced a flat, non-rotational plane with the heavens in motion overhead, a sun and moon of equal size moving overhead in similar patterns, water not sticking to the outside of objects, laws of physics not altering how they operate based on scale or distance, that sort of thing. Learning that the radical difference between my daily experience and the globe model I had always believed in was due to the globe being a fairy tale was about as earth-shattering as going to bed on Tuesday night, and waking up the next day to find it was Wednesday. Cognitive dissonance is a psychological term describing a situation where someone has learned something which goes against what they already know or believe to be true. The two contradictory ideas have to be assimilated, or one of them rejected outright. This mechanism is hardwired into the way the brain works, and has been exploited by those who wish to play shepherd to the human race since the year dot. My belief now is that by learning how to accept the possibility of all truths, even those which seem at the present level of understanding to be conflicting with one another, we take one of the truest paths to understanding some of the great mysteries. The goal is not, as many on the outside might interpret, to find and believe in bizarre new cultish fantasies, but to realise and thus let go of all the bizarre cultish fantasies on which the old-fashioned patriarchal society is founded. Those of us who make up the loosely defined truther movement are those human beings who have somehow managed to hotwire their own brains and become free of cognitive dissonance. It is a path strewn with hazards, not least of all potential alienation, self-doubt and paranoia. But for the mentally strong, this can be our path to self-awareness, provided we can find a way to ground what we are learning into our daily lives. The way I see it, there are three broad categories of information available. Firstly, there is distorted mainstream information, which supports the default way of looking at things. Within this category is the illusion of duality, left versus right, us versus them, and so on. There is a subtext present in 99.9% of this type of information, and even if you're smart about consumption, which most of us, even among the general population, seem to be, you're still exposing your subconscious to the narratives intentionally included as subliminal messaging, and the wider collection of ideas that even the program makers themselves are unconscious of including. These are the really massive collectively held beliefs which don't even start to become apparent until near total abstinence is achieved and perspective subsequently gained. There is purely factual information which makes no attempt to sway or program the one who consumes it. This would be legitimate frontline scientific research, for example, which is always very hesitant to make black and white conclusions, and not Cancer Research UK, for example, who claim to be science-backed and therefore purely factual, but in fact clearly have their own distortions, and so actually belong in the first category. Finally, there is deliberately out-of-the-box information which invites the viewer or listener to think critically of what has gone before. In this final category, there are channels which may be concealing a hidden agenda, and some which openly promote themselves as alternatives, such as my own. When I personally want alternative source information, I look for the smallest channels I can find, the ones YouTube isn't recommending, run by one person for their own amusement, sharing their own views. That's what you will find if you look back at my channel's upload history.
Do you think this is a good way to learn about the world?
If you approach this kind of information as you did school, then no. You shouldn't approach any sort of information that way, to be honest, with the exception perhaps of an instruction manual for servicing a machine of some kind. You're a sponge in that state, fast learning, but vulnerable, programmable. All truth channels, all true teachers and guides and prophets of any form, the true ones, state very clearly in one form or another, take what resonates and leave the rest. None of my school teachers ever said that. The day I hear of a mainstream news anchor saying something similar, I might consider tuning in to a broadcast or two. This simple approach to learning simultaneously both opens us up to radical new avenues of thought, whilst protecting us from brainwashing. And it's critical to develop such an approach in this age of information overload. As soon as you label something as a conspiracy, or you label your treatment of it as a debunking, you're setting it up to fail any and all subsequent tests of legitimacy before you even begin to learn just what is being presented, and doing so based on previous assumptions about the way things are. If someone makes what sounds like a tenuous claim, I do advise skepticism. But skepticism is often confused nowadays with outright and immediate rejection.
In order not to be taken for a fool, I must reject everything that doesn't fit fairly neatly into the commonly agreed upon worldview I already know.
This is an absolutely dreadful approach to making a critical appraisal of the world around us, especially as it's transforming so rapidly, and especially since information is so carefully controlled nowadays. Controversial content is suppressed through metrics manipulation, whilst the illusion of truly free discourse is simultaneously being touted by every government leader, news network and social media platform. So what's the benefit? What's the payoff? The positive conclusion? So-called conspiracy theories, conspiratorial thinking in general, has been the gateway to true open-mindedness for countless millions. At the very least, we can safely say that challenging the established order of things is a commonality among all free-thinking individuals. I'm less interested though in garden variety open-mindedness where, yes, this could all be a 3D hologram projected from the edge of the universe, which requires little imagination or commitment from the thinker, by the way. Conversely, these conspiracy theories, these particular pathways of intellectual investigation, are jailbreaking people's evaluation of what reality is and what it might possibly be. Why do I say there is no imagination or commitment in what I term garden variety open-mindedness? Because what difference to your life does it make if this reality is a hologram indistinguishable from the real thing, for example? What difference would it make if my red was your green, for example? These are the kind of way out there theories that are commonly discussed even amongst mainstream thinkers, and yet somehow don't get labelled as conspiracies. Why not? These ideas don't have any knock-on effect in the outside world. They don't have implications which require people to change anything about their worldview. They exist as philosophical concepts in a vacuum. In short, they don't inflict cognitive dissonance. When we start talking about faked moon landings and flat earths, for example, when we start asking if our present understanding of virology is in fact a complete misinterpretation, a myth propagated by pharmaceutical companies who profit from people's sickness, and indeed from healthy people's fear of potentially becoming sick, well, now we've got a problem. If the various intelligence agencies know these so-called terror attacks are coming, and yet do less than nothing to prevent them, and then try to lie about the fact, well, now we have to start asking serious and more wide-ranging questions, don't we? Of the so-called authorities, and of ourselves. As within, so without, as always. Thank you for watching. If you appreciate the work I do on the channel, the biggest favour you could do me would be sharing the video off platform, for example to any Facebook groups you're part of that you think might vibe with the message. If you use Instagram at all, follow me at myfrequencies_ for quotes both original and from great minds throughout history. Link below. I really appreciate the support. You can also click the links on the screen to see more of my work here on YouTube.